In 1619, a Dutch ship sailed into Jamestown, Virginia, carrying a human cargo of 20 African men and women. This moment, though seemingly unremarkable at the time, marked the inception of a profound transformation in the labor dynamics of the English colonies. These individuals were brought to meet the insatiable demand for labor in a fledgling settlement struggling to survive. The tobacco economy, rapidly emerging as the colony's lifeline, required an extensive and reliable workforce. Initially, English settlers relied heavily on indentured servitude, contracted laborers, primarily of European origin, who worked for a specified number of years in exchange for passage to the New World and the promise of freedom. However, this system presented limitations. Indentured servants, though often treated brutally, had a defined term of service and the possibility of joining the free population. Additionally, Native Americans, another potential labor source, could not be easily enslaved. Their intimate knowledge of the land allowed them to resist captivity and escape colonist control. In contrast, the Africans brought to Jamestown faced barriers that tethered them permanently to servitude. Unfamiliar with the geography, separated from their cultural and linguistic networks, and subjected to a developing system of racial distinctions, they became the backbone of an evolving economy rooted in human exploitation. The importation of African laborers was not initially accompanied by a rigidly defined system of racial slavery. Historical records suggest that in some cases, Africans worked alongside white servants under similar conditions. Yet, by the mid-17th century, the colonial framework began to harden. Legal codes and societal norms increasingly designated Africans as perpetual laborers, tied to the land and their masters without hope of emancipation. This emergent system of bondage, distinct from the limited servitude imposed on Europeans, laid the foundation for racial slavery as a cornerstone of American society. It was not a matter of circumstance but the deliberate shaping of colonial economies and societies to benefit a small elite, while relegating Africans to a status of absolute subjugation. The early English colonies in America were fraught with challenges, and labor shortages quickly emerged as a critical obstacle to their survival. The settlers, many of whom were unaccustomed to the harsh realities of agricultural labor, found themselves in desperate need of workers to sustain the burgeoning tobacco economy. Tobacco, a crop of immense value in European markets, demanded extensive cultivation and processing, tasks that required a large, stable workforce. This necessity shaped the colony's policies and priorities in profound ways. At first, the English relied on indentured servitude as the primary means of addressing this labor shortage. Indentured servants, mostly poor Europeans, entered into contracts agreeing to work for a specific number of years in exchange for passage to the Americas and the promise of land or freedom dues upon the completion of their term. However, the system had inherent limitations. Indentured servants retained a legal status that eventually guaranteed their release, which meant that the colonies had to continually replenish their workforce. Additionally, many of these servants fled or resisted their exploitative conditions, creating instability within the labor supply. Native Americans were another potential source of labor, but efforts to enslave them proved futile. Indigenous communities were deeply resistant to colonization, and their intimate knowledge of the land made escape a viable and frequent outcome. Moreover, violent conflicts and epidemics that decimated their populations further rendered them an unreliable labor source. Amid these challenges, the colonists increasingly turned their attention to African labor. Africans brought to the Americas were stripped of the social and geographical advantages that had allowed Native Americans to evade enslavement. They were unfamiliar with the territory, isolated from support networks, and subjected to the racial ideologies that began to take root in colonial society. These factors made African captives an ideal solution to the labor crisis, positioning them as the cornerstone of an emerging system of exploitation that would define the colony's economic and social order for centuries. The transition from a labor system dependent on indentured servants to one based on racialized slavery was underpinned by deliberate economic and legal developments. In the 17th century, English colonial authorities began crafting a system of laws that entrenched racial distinctions and ensured a permanent, hereditary labor force for the growing plantation economy. These laws were not born out of random necessity, but were carefully designed to address economic needs while consolidating social hierarchies. An example of this legal shift is the 1640 case of John Punch. Punch, an African laborer, escaped from servitude alongside two white indentured servants. When the men were captured, the court's ruling was starkly unequal. The white men were sentenced to extended terms of servitude, while Punch was condemned to servitude for life. This legal precedent marked a significant moment in the creation of a racial hierarchy within the labor system, with black servitude increasingly defined as perpetual. Laws continued to evolve throughout the colonies to codify and expand the racial divide. By the mid-17th century, statutes declared that the status of a child would follow that of the mother, a departure from English common law that ensured children born to enslaved women would also be enslaved. These legal innovations were designed to secure a growing, self-replicating labor force without reliance on external supply chains or contractual obligations. The economic rationale for these laws was undeniable. Slavery offered planters a cost-effective solution to the labor shortage that indentured servitude could not sustain. Enslaved Africans, unlike indentured servants, represented a permanent labor class, one whose exploitation could be systematized over generations. The burgeoning plantation economies, particularly in the tobacco and later sugar-producing regions, thrived on this structured inequality. By institutionalizing these racial distinctions, colonial authorities not only solved immediate labor concerns, but also created a framework for managing potential dissent. The legal system ensured that poor whites were distinguished from enslaved blacks, granting them minor privileges that discouraged solidarity across racial lines. This calculated strategy of division helped maintain the economic and social dominance of the colonial elite while embedding racism deeply within the emerging structures of American society. The emergence of slavery in colonial America was not only an economic and legal development, but also a cultural construction. English settlers, drawing on long-standing European traditions, wove racial superiority into the ideological framework that justified the subjugation of Africans. This cultural justification was crucial in sustaining the institution of slavery and ensuring its acceptance across generations. In English culture, the color black had long been associated with negative connotations, death, sin, and impurity, while whiteness symbolized purity and virtue. These associations, deeply embedded in religious, literary, and social traditions, provided a foundation for viewing Africans as inherently inferior. By framing blackness as not just a physical trait but a moral deficiency, colonists justified the dehumanization of African peoples. Religion also played a central role in these cultural justifications. African captives were often depicted as heathens, lacking the Christian faith that European settlers regarded as a marker of civilization. This allowed colonists to rationalize their actions as a form of paternalistic salvation. Enslaving Africans, they argued, was a means of introducing them to Christianity and thereby redeeming their souls. However, this was not about genuine conversion or equality. Instead, it was a mechanism to portray the institution of slavery as both moral and necessary. The cultural rationale extended to the supposed savagery and primitiveness attributed to African societies. European explorers and colonists often dismissed the complex social, political, and cultural systems of African civilizations as inferior or non-existent. By diminishing African humanity in this way, colonial powers constructed an image of enslaved people as naturally suited for subordination. These cultural justifications were more than rhetorical tools. They were deeply ingrained in the social fabric of colonial life. They influenced laws, shaped interpersonal relationships, and became a key element in the self-perception of white settlers. Over time, these beliefs evolved into the pervasive racial ideologies that outlived the institution of slavery itself, continuing to shape societal structures and attitudes. This cultural scaffolding ensured that racism was not merely a consequence of slavery, but a perpetuating force deeply embedded in the colonial psyche. As the institution of slavery solidified in the American colonies, its architects relied on a calculated strategy of division and control to maintain their dominance. The racial hierarchy that emerged was not merely a byproduct of economic necessity, but a deliberate construct designed to prevent unity among the oppressed. At its core was a system that pitted white laborers against enslaved Africans, ensuring that economic grievances would not translate into collective resistance. In the early colonial period, white indentured servants and African slaves often worked side by side under similar harsh conditions. Their shared experiences occasionally led to alliances, including acts of rebellion. However, these alliances posed a significant threat to the ruling class. Elites recognized the power of unified dissent and moved swiftly to undermine it. Laws and social norms were engineered to drive a wedge between poor whites and black slaves, offering the former a marginally better status within the colonial hierarchy. This divide was both psychological and material. White laborers were granted small but significant privileges, such as access to legal protections, reduced punishments for infractions, and the prospect of eventual freedom. These benefits reinforced a sense of superiority over enslaved Africans, fostering a belief that their interests aligned more closely with the elite than with their black counterparts. At the same time, enslaved Africans were subjected to increasingly brutal and dehumanizing conditions, ensuring their permanent subjugation and distinguishing their plight from that of poor whites. The ideological component of this strategy cannot be understated. By promoting a narrative of racial superiority, colonial authorities legitimized the privileges granted to poor whites and naturalized the subordination of black slaves. This ideology seeped into every aspect of colonial life, from legal codes to religious teachings, embedding racism deeply into the cultural fabric. Ultimately, the strategy of division and control served a dual purpose. It protected the economic interests of the elite by ensuring a reliable labor force while simultaneously preventing the emergence of a united front that could challenge the existing power structure. The racial divisions it created became one of the most enduring legacies of colonial America, shaping societal dynamics long after the abolition of slavery. Despite the harsh and divisive structures imposed by the colonial system, there were notable instances of resistance and solidarity that disrupted the social order. Among the enslaved Africans and oppressed white laborers, shared grievances occasionally overcame the barriers erected by the ruling classes, leading to moments of unity and rebellion. One of the most striking examples of this solidarity occurred during various labor revolts in the colonies. These uprisings often saw poor whites and enslaved Africans joining forces against their common oppressors. The elites, who depended on the exploitation of both groups, viewed these alliances as an existential threat. Their shared anger over exploitation and dehumanizing conditions provided fertile ground for collective action, underscoring the potential for unity across racial lines. In Virginia, Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 stands as a significant case of such resistance. Initially sparked by frontier settlers' grievances against Native American policies, the rebellion quickly evolved into a Bee-Croter uprising that drew together black slaves, white indentured servants, and disenfranchised freemen. Together, they attacked the plantations of wealthy elites and briefly disrupted the colonial power structure. While the rebellion ultimately failed, it deeply alarmed the ruling class, demonstrating the potential power of cross-racial solidarity. These acts of resistance were met with swift and severe retaliation. Colonial authorities implemented harsher laws to criminalize and punish collaboration between white and black laborers. Anti-miscegenation laws, as well as new legal distinctions between enslaved Africans and indentured whites, were designed to weaken the bonds that rebellion had forged. These measures were coupled with propaganda that reinforced racial hierarchies and fostered animosity between groups. Yet, even as the elites worked tirelessly to divide, moments of resistance persisted. In plantations, ships, and settlements, Enslaved Africans and oppressed laborers found ways to resist their conditions through subtle acts of defiance, from work slowdowns to escaping together. These acts, though often suppressed or undocumented, revealed an enduring capacity for human solidarity in the face of systemic oppression. These moments of unity and resistance remind us that the divisions fostered by the colonial system were not inevitable. They were imposed, maintained, and enforced through deliberate actions. The resistance to these divisions, though ultimately suppressed in many cases, serves as a testament to the enduring human desire for justice and equality, even in the most oppressive circumstances. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.